As its global influence dwindles, this once dominant nation finds itself being both demonized, if not shunned, by much of the region it once tightly controlled. And as sanctions mount, this nation has also been increasingly excluded from the international bargaining table. The inadequacies of this superpower's once fearsome military have also been exposed by an ill-conceived military action aimed at a neighboring country. And as the forces of both nations remain locked in a frustrating and deadly stalemate, thousands of poorly led and inadequately trained troops become casualties, which has only served to amplify an attitude of dissent within the aggressor's ranks. This, you might be thinking, sounds a lot like the current state of the Russian Federation, and in that thinking, you'd be correct. But this scene is actually a rough depiction of the predicament faced by the Soviet Union in 1989. 2 years before it officially collapsed. Does this mean modern-day Russia is also headed for catastrophe? Well, history does have a way of repeating itself. In the early 1980s, the Soviet Union's incursion into Afghanistan set off a prolonged and draining conflict that depleted both resources and manpower. This 10-year conflict, often referred to as the Soviet-Afghan War, not only increased political tensions during the Cold War, but it also resulted in long-lasting consequences for the region and complicated the geopolitical landscape for decades. Unlike the United States, the Soviet Union did not have the financial means to support this sort of prolonged endeavor in the Middle East. However controversial and misguided many of its actions have been, the US had what the Soviet Union didn't then, and Russia doesn't now: the extensive resources and, perhaps more importantly, the necessary partnerships to show up this sort of unconventional, open-ended military venture. Fast forward to present day, and there certainly seems to be a number of similarities between the Soviet Union's 10-year fiasco in Afghanistan and Russia's current invasion of Ukraine. Will this be the spark that burns down the Russia Federation? Well, if we trust the lessons of history, it certainly seems to be trending in that direction. And if Russia is doomed, what other factors might contribute to its eventual downfall? How the collapse of Russia might unfold is a complex question. It certainly seems, though, that the process has already begun. As sanctions increase and Russia becomes more politically isolated, irreparable damage is being done to the economy, which, if not controlled, will likely result in the ousting of President Vladimir Putin, along with the rest of his regime and any successor he might try to put in his place. For several reasons, this scenario might seem improbable, but foreign policy experts have continued to sound the alarm, warning the West to take the possibility of Russia's demise seriously and make adequate preparations. The Russian Federation, many experts are saying, as it presently exists, might crumble within the next decade, with the ongoing conflict in Ukraine being largely identified as the chief catalyst. With that said, plenty of experts are also saying that the collapse of Russia is impossible. However, before the Soviet Union fell, it too appeared to be a stable and enduring global superpower with a formidable military. So for now, it's probably best to entertain the possibility of either scenario. Then, once you've got all the necessary information, decide for yourself. Looking way back to the beginning of 1991, the Soviet Union was the largest country in the world, covering some 8,650,000 square miles, 22,400,000 square kilometers, nearly 1/6 of the Earth's total landmass. At that time, it had a population of over 290 million people, and there were 100 distinct nationalities living within its borders. So why, within a year, did the USSR cease to exist? From what was once the world's largest totalitarian empire, 15 independent countries ultimately emerged, each embarking on its own unique path of development. Most of the former Soviet republics, however, with the exception of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, leaned toward a familiar pattern of authoritarian rule and relatively weak civil society. But as crippling as unbridled authoritarianism can be for a nation, it's impossible to pinpoint a single cause leading to an event as complex as the dissolution of such a formidable nation, which makes the potential collapse of Russia an equally complex and sensitive matter to address. A matter that definitely needs to be examined through a number of different lenses, which means we will need to reach a much deeper understanding of a few key things, including the current state of Russian society, Russia's current and future economic situation, the dark and secretive world of Russian politics, and strengths and failures of Russia's military-industrial complex. But as we explore these areas, it will be important to keep in mind that whatever happens to Russia, if the state descends into perpetual chaos, or if some new democratic structure emerges, the impact of such a dramatic downfall would undoubtedly be felt across the globe, and would not only shift the current dynamic between most of the world's superpowers, but it would also radically alter the lives of millions of individuals. Today, we'll explore the overall feasibility of a collapse and weigh the warnings of experts. Are these mostly sensationalized, or are they grounded in realistic insights and information regarding the current state of Putin's regime? And what, we will attempt to determine, are the potential political and economic changes we can expect to see, both regionally and internationally, in a post-Russia world. Lots of these changes, we can be sure, and perhaps the ones that will be most obvious to the larger world will largely affect Russia's current industries and organizations, as well as its political power dynamics and overall military strategy. But we can't forget that large, sweeping changes such as these will also significantly impact Russia's citizens. We can't forget that every nation is made up first of people. And even if Russia's state media is unlikely to acknowledge the possibility of a future collapse, the fear of this reality looms heavy over much of the Russian population. Which is why, to begin our exploration of Russia's potential dismantling, we're first going to look at the range of societal factors that could very likely contribute to not only the downfall of Putin's regime, but the subsequent fall of Russia. For huge swaths of the Russian people, as the war with Ukraine drags on, life has gotten increasingly more difficult, making social unrest a far more prevalent issue in the region. People generally aren't happy with unaddressed economic disparities, limited opportunities, and being drafted into a floundering military. Many people want change, especially among the younger generation, and social movements calling for fairness on the political playing field are starting to shake up the current regime. Which makes sense, because for any democracy to flourish and for any country to grow and prosper, there must be room for a thriving and lively civil society. A society in which a wide and diverse range of people are given the opportunity to actively participate. To keep a population happy on the way to creating a truly civil society, there must be a sense of inclusion. If the desired goal of a nation is to freely develop and ultimately thrive, this needs to be a fundamental national interest. In a largely authoritarian state like Russia, however, the rise of a civil society where organizations and institutions are allowed to exist outside the government's influence and where citizens are linked by common interests and activity is often viewed as a potential threat rather than a benefit, which usually leads to increased efforts by the state to control the population it's supposed to be serving. Russia, except during some of the more chaotic periods in its history, has rarely experienced the benefits of a vibrant, free society. They got the taste of one after the back-to-back revolutions of 1917, but these events were neither well-organized nor openly legitimized by the political groups in power at the time. Then there was the brief period of transformation occurring through the 1990s that came after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But other than these, a series of autocrats have generally dominated, which has left the Russian people mostly subject to some form of arbitrary and oppressive authoritarian rule. Take, as an example, the winter elections of 2011-2012. When then-President Dmitry Medvedev announced that he would not be running for a second term so that former President Vladimir Putin could step back in for a third term, an appointment that was only possible because of a recent amendment made to the Constitution. After his announcement, a series of massive protests erupted, comparable in scale to those surrounding the collapse of the Soviet Union. The outrage of Russians went mostly unheard then, as it continues to do so now, which has led millions of angry, fearful, or simply fed-up citizens to protest with their feet, you might say. When push comes to shove, the simple fact is that unhappy people aren't going to stick around. Millions of Russians, some of its wealthiest and most highly educated citizens among them, have been streaming out of the country since shortly after the invasion of Ukraine, a significant exodus that has only added to the ongoing decline of Russia's overall population numbers. Low birth rates have, too, been an ongoing issue. In the first 10 months of 2019, for example, deaths outnumbered live births by nearly 260,000, marking the steepest decline in Russia's population since 2008. The underlying problem here is that shrinkages like this, whether they're the result of low birth rates or mass immigration, can strain a nation's workforce, damage its economy, and stress to the point of breaking its existing social welfare programs. For Russia, or any nation, fixing the problem of population decline means coming up with policies that make people hopeful enough to start or grow families and encourage skilled workers to stick around. But because this isn't being done, many Russian companies have begun to experience ongoing staffing shortages and increasing difficulty hiring new employees. According to Russia's largest private bank, Alfa Bank, more than 1.5% of Russia's entire workforce may have already left the country, many of them highly skilled professionals, and many of these people, it seems, decided to take their money with them. Sources say that during the early stages of the war in Ukraine alone, well over 1 million people left Russia, taking with them a record 1.2 trillion rubles, $15 billion, out of Russia's central bank. And it's safe to say that since then, that amount has only continued to grow. With no signs of slowing down, thousands of intellectuals, artists, professionals, and young people have continued to stream from the country, to the extent that representatives of the media and various governments have started calling the event a detrimental brain drain amidst the Russian population. And let's not forget about the scientists. Reportedly, the number of scientists living in Russia has decreased by around 25% over the past 2 decades, greatly hindering the country's ability to achieve its goal of technological independence. According to a source from the Russian Academy of Sciences, Russia has lost around 50,000 scientists over the past 5 years alone, many of them leaving right on the heels of the attack on Ukraine. Apparently, no other country in history has experienced such a dramatic decline in their scientific workforce in that short of time frame. This has created a critical situation for Russia, given that many of those who fled the Putin regime are precisely the individuals a country most needs to sustain a modern economy. And if losing their scientists and artists wasn't bad enough, it's been reported that some 15,000 millionaires applied for permanent immigration status elsewhere and plan to leave the country by the end of 2022, taking their much-needed investment capital with them. Many of those who've left so far have been, understandably, fearful of a potentially deteriorating economy and rapidly diminishing quality of life. While at the same time, large numbers of others have been justifiably concerned about facing repercussions for not supporting the war. And when the punishment for insubordination is over a decade in prison, who can blame them? Russians who were concerned about being openly critical of the war in Ukraine before certainly have good reason to be worried now. In March 2022, Putin signed a new law stating that anyone who distributes what the Kremlin considers to be false information about the Russian military could be looking at up to 15 years in prison, leaving a large number of Russia's most influential figures with few options other than support the war, remain silent, or leave. Many seem to have chosen the latter. But this isn't the first time the Russian government has attempted to trample over its citizens' freedom of expression. 3 years earlier, in March 2019, the Russian parliament rolled out a new law that gave the courts the power to hand down fines or even throw people in jail for what they called indecent online posts. And what does the Russian parliament consider to be indecent? Anything implying any form of disrespect toward government officials, including Putin, or demonstrates what they consider to be disrespectful toward society, the country, any state symbols, the Russian constitution, or the authorities that enforce it. Cross the line, and you could be looking at a fine as high as 100,000 rubles, around $1,300. Do it again, and you're looking at double the fine, and perhaps 15 days in prison. Yes, this new era of suppression under Putin is certainly extreme. But it's also important that we don't get caught up in thinking the good old days were a more harmonious time. The chaotic civil landscape in Russia during the 1990s, after the USSR fell, was dominated by bandit capitalism, rampant criminal activity, pervasive corruption, widespread disorder, and economic collapse, but all under the sparkling banner of freedom and democracy. Facing an increasingly dangerous and unpredictable future, Russian authorities had no choice but to try and drive society back towards economic, political, and social stability. And when Putin first assumed the presidency back in 2000, this became his central focus. By whatever means necessary, and we do mean whatever, he intended to bolster the economy, fortify the state, consolidate power and reinstate his vision of order throughout the nation. The fragility of Russia's new society, combined with the overwhelming desire most people had for stability, made it considerably easier for him to follow through on these goals. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, leading up to the reign of Putin, life in Russia underwent a series of profound changes. The era of food shortages, substandard products, lengthy queues, crowded cooperative apartments, and restrictions on private property and travel became nightmares of the past. And for the first time they could remember, many Russians were enjoying the freedom to decide where to live, work, and travel. With the advent of the market economy, consumerism surged as cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg welcomed some of the world's finest restaurants and widespread internet use. The benefits of this transformation, however, were not evenly distributed, as most of Russia's more rural areas continued to face persistent challenges such as extreme poverty. These disparities in progress led many Russians, particularly those who were older or less aligned with Western values, longing to preserve more traditional ways of life, including many of the ideas and ideals associated with the Soviet era. Today, it's been reported that some 35 million Russians live in houses or apartments without indoor toilets. 47 million do not have hot water. 29 million do not have running water inside their homes, and 22 million do not have central heating. Overall, just 62.7% of the Russian population has standard modern comforts like running water, indoor plumbing, heating, and gas or electric stoves. Clearly, times have remained tough for Russians. Some might still feel nostalgic about the good old days before the fall of the USSR, while others have decided to focus their attention on life today and hope for a better future. One such person is Yegor Zhukov, a 21-year-old university student who found himself in a Moscow courtroom facing charges of extremism. His crime? Openly discussing nonviolent protests, political power dynamics, and his bid for a seat on the Moscow City Council. During his trial on December 4, 2019, Zhukov boldly critiqued the Russian political system and its detrimental impact on society. "We let this be done to us, and who have we become?" he said. "We have become a nation that's unlearned responsibility. We have become a nation that has unlearned love." After being reproduced by Russian-American journalist Masha Gessen in an article in The New Yorker, Zhukov's statement became a media sensation that would go on to symbolize many of the glaring flaws of Putin's Russia. It turns out that the only traditional institution that the Russian state truly respects and protects is the institution of autocracy. Zhukov also said, "Autocracy aims to destroy anyone who actually wants to work for the benefit of the homeland, who isn't scared to love and take on responsibility." Surprisingly, for his open insubordination, Zhukov received a relatively light sentence, just 3 years probation, likely due to the public's strong reaction to his statement and the international attention it generated. The important thing to note here is that Zhukov wasn't some decorated scholar of sociology or some political opposition leader or some popular figure in the media. He was a 21-year-old college student who had lived his entire life under Putin's regime. And as a result, he'd grown deeply concerned about the future of his country and its people. It's hard to pin down the specific role the Russian people will play in the potential collapse of their country, but it's this sort of person who has only their life to lose by speaking out, who will likely point us in the right direction. In the coming months or years, it's possible that Putin's authoritarian regime will come to an unceremonious end. Even if it does, though, it's unlikely that the straight-up dissolution of Russia will follow. Depending on how things go, specific regions might become eager for their independence, but it's also very possible that many of the republics that chose to stay part of Russia when the Cold War ended will continue to do so. But regardless of the shape Russia comes to take down the road, no country can thrive economically if it cannot retain the bulk of its intellectual and material wealth. Long-term economic growth will be impossible. The economy will stagnate, and international investment will become increasingly scarce. This will not be good news for Putin, considering his popularity rests, to a significant degree, on the perception of him as a skilled technocrat who's more than capable of ensuring Russia's continued economic success. But what if he can't? If not addressed, won't Russia's economic vulnerability, which stems mainly from its poor diversity, play a crucial role in its eventual downfall? That's the next piece of the Russian puzzle we need to examine. Though he's been largely aided by high oil prices, to his credit, Putin has been able to raise the standard of living for a large segment of the Russian population. As one of the world's leading oil exporters, Russia's per capita GDP grew by 7.3% per year from 1999 to 2008. However, while major cities such as Moscow and St. Petersburg were enjoying this economic boom, and many of Russia's citizens were focusing on the benefits of an elevated lifestyle, the Kremlin was making moves to consolidate the nation's power. And when the dust settled, this apparent balance of interests between the Russian people and the state would prove to be short-lived. Really, it took a series of shocks in 2008 to finally break the spell. First, it was a worldwide economic crisis, sparked by the collapse of the U.S. housing market. Then came a major drop in oil prices. And lastly, there was a shift at the top among Russia's political leaders. Individually and in combination, these events added fuel to the fires of discontent that had been smoldering below the surface of Russian society for many years. Looking forward to today, recovery from these events, especially the 2008 economic collapse, have been slow. And all the while, corruption at the highest levels of the Kremlin, down to the local officials, has continued. In many cases, taking the form of abusive conduct by law enforcement and arbitrary decisions by the courts, further discouraging and depressing the Russian population. But as we said, the economy under Putin has in some ways continued to flourish, largely due to its higher-than-average hydrocarbon revenues and the strategic use of its existing stockpiles to mitigate the impact of import sanctions, defying the expectations of many. Russia's future economic health, however, could still be a ticking time bomb headed for a violent implosion. In such turbulent times, in a country propped up by such an undiversified economy, anything could happen. Just look at the Soviet Union of 1990. At the time, it had the second largest economy in the world, but was still facing regular shortages of consumer goods, widespread hoarding, and an enormous black market economy that accounted for over 10% of its official GDP. Over time, economic stagnation worsened. Wage increases were fueled by carelessly printing money, which only led to runaway inflation. On top of that, ongoing financial mismanagement by the state left the country highly susceptible to fluctuations in a range of external markets. And so, when the price of oil eventually fell through the floor, it triggered an economic cascade and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Just as Russia does today, the Soviet Union depended on the exportation of oil and gas to survive as a nation. Yet, as we've seen, that can be risky business. Fluctuations in global energy prices can bring about huge, hard-to-reverse changes, especially to an economy as undiversified as Russia's. This is not a good situation to be in, but it gets worse. Russia is also facing the consequences of being almost totally isolated from the global markets for many high-tech products, making the supply and upkeep of modern tools and equipment a serious challenge, especially on the battlefield in Ukraine. The situation has gotten so bad, in fact, that the Russian army has had to resort to using scavenged microprocessors from civilian appliances to keep some of its missile systems online, a predicament created by the embargo imposed by Taiwan, currently the world's largest manufacturer of electronic components. And yet, despite facing some of the most stringent sanctions in recent history, the Russian economy appears to be grinding along. You won't find a number of popular consumer goods in Moscow at the moment, like Guinness beer, Zara clothes, or Nespresso coffee pods. But that's only an inconvenience. The real problem is that staple goods, including many forms of medication, have also become nearly impossible to acquire. To make matters worse, several major commercial aircraft manufacturers, including Boeing and Airbus, have both canceled maintenance contracts and stopped supplying spare parts. Now critically short on replacement parts, Russia also lacks the capability to manufacture them domestically, leaving aircrews to cannibalize other planes for parts in order to sustain the industry's dwindling commercial fleet. This situation poses a serious safety risk for those using Russian air travel, which means we could be looking at the collapse of Russia's airline industry in the very near future. But the airlines aren't the only ones cutting business ties with Russia. Since the invasion of Ukraine began, more than 1,000 companies have publicly announced their intention to either close down their operations in Russia completely or scale back beyond the minimum legally required by international sanctions, To name just a small fraction of the most recognizable brands, companies who've already closed up shop there include McDonald's, Spotify, Adidas, H&M, IKEA, Disney, Apple, and Harley-Davidson. Also concerning is the health of the Russian ruble, which, after reaching a record low against the US dollar, has crumbled down to, well, rubble. Inflation, too, has soared, reaching a 20-year high of nearly 18% in April 2022, but would, after recovering slowly, end the year at 13.4%. To soften the blow, Putin ordered a 10% increase in pensions and the minimum wage, to be paid with what money, many have asked. In typical style for the ever-evasive autocrat, even amidst a hailstorm of Western sanctions, through 2023, Putin has continued to paint a rosy picture of the country's economic situation. But the experts don't agree. The real situation, many have said, is much uglier than the one being advertised by the Kremlin, which means that official reports on the Russian economy are likely not the most accurate representation of how the Russian economy is doing. Perhaps because the officials who are putting these reports together have a very real incentive to keep the Kremlin happy. Other reports have revealed, despite internally reported GDP growth, there's been no significant increase in prosperity among the Russian population. Instead, interest rates have risen to support the weakened ruble, crushing millions of individual citizens under a mountain of debt. In fact, it's been estimated that the second quarter of 2023, about 15.7 million people in Russia were living below the poverty line, surviving on just over 14,000 rubles, $196 per month. Really, it's not all that surprising there have been so many misconceptions regarding the state of the Russian economy. Since the invasion, the Kremlin has been highly selective about the economic data it presents, regularly highlighting favorable metrics and omitting any unfavorable ones. Then these Putin-chosen statistics are broadcast by state media outlets, some of which get inadvertently spread by international experts and reporters who might otherwise be well-intentioned. This makes what's really happening in Russia hard to determine, but we can be relatively sure it's darker than the state is willing to say. Realistically, though, despite some leaks in the system, it appears that Russia's access to valuable imports has mostly disappeared. Securing essential products, parts, and technologies from increasingly hesitant trade partners has become a struggle, while supply shortages within its domestic economy have only gotten worse. And despite Putin's aspirations for self-sufficiency and to secure reliable substitution imports, domestic production in Russia has too mostly ground to a halt. Putin has simply been unable to replace the businesses, products, and talent he's already lost. Really, to grasp the seriousness of this situation, you probably don't need any other stat than this. The companies that have left already represent approximately 40% of Russia's GDP. The truth is, Russia's domestic innovation and production base is being hollowed out, as soaring prices and consumer discontent have reversed nearly 3 decades worth of foreign investment, driving the current unprecedented exodus of both talent and investment capital, significantly eroding the foundation of Russia's economy. Overall, it appears that Putin's aggressive actions have only strengthened the bond between Biden and many key European leaders. Bolstered by international support, the White House has continued to implement sanctions that will cut off Moscow's access to international banking and finance systems, while plenty of EU leaders are implementing sanctions of their own. For instance, shortly after the war in Ukraine began, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz halted production of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which had been intended to deliver Russian gas to much of Europe. Heavily reliant on oil and gas exports, Russia's economy may not survive such a hit. But this could also create considerable hardship for the rest of Europe, which currently depends on Russia for 40% of its energy. If things are allowed to continue as they are, Russia is likely to face growing isolation from international financial markets and the crucial capital required for recovery. And should Putin remain at the helm, a global community united against Russia seems inevitable, as does the prospect of a slow, painful economic death. At this point, a change in leadership might be the only thing that can slow or stop the decline of Russia's economy. But that could be an epic battle in itself, given the current state of Russia's political landscape. Which brings us to our next area of examination: and raises the question, how might Russia's centralized and authoritative government contribute to its potential collapse? Well, high levels of corruption and an absence of political accountability certainly won't help the matter. Not to mention the widespread civil unrest that often results. Does Putin really think he can keep the power of Russia consolidated in just a few sets of hands and not have problems? We've already established that Russia is facing some serious societal and economic challenges, but it will also be important to look at its dysfunctional political landscape. At the moment, Putin's situation is looking increasingly grim, but this may not matter much for his long-term political aspirations. Currently, he has no significant political opposition within the Russian Federation, mostly because he's spent the past 2 decades systematically eliminating any potential adversaries or possible dissenters. But hey, who's counting? There are those advocating bravely for democracy, but this movement lacks a charismatic leader to unify its efforts and, if it becomes necessary, lead a revolution. Using a keen understanding of history and a range of ruthless tactics, including but not limited to suppression and imprisonment, Putin has successfully prevented his own ousting from power for over 20 years. Certainly aware of the criticism directed at his regime, Putin's policy of political suppression could possibly stem from a lingering fear that the history of the Soviet Union will one day repeat itself. For Putin has seen what can happen when ideas and speech are allowed to run free. And perhaps he doesn't want to make the same mistakes as Mikhail Gorbachev, who, after becoming the General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1985, set about trying to revitalize the stagnating Soviet economy and simplify the bureaucratic government structure. First, he implemented glasnost, a policy of openness and transparency aimed to improve the dialogue between government institutions, the media, and the general public. Then he introduced perestroika, a set of political and economic reforms intended to modernize and enhance the Soviet Union by making the economy more efficient, increasing political transparency, and improving relations with the West. On the face of it, this sounds like a pretty good deal. But was it? Intended to revive certain communist ideals, glasnost would instead lead to a tidal wave of criticism directed at the current Soviet system and the state ultimately losing control over the media and public discourse. Sadly, the perestroika policies didn't do much better. Price controls were lifted for some markets, but bureaucratic structures remained firmly intact, enabling communist officials to resist any changes they disagreed with. On the one hand, Gorbachev spoke often about the importance of trust and sharing information with all Soviet citizens. But it became painfully clear later on that this sharing of information was designed to draw attention to only specific problems selected by those in power, not ordinary citizens. Whatever Gorbachev's original vision was for glasnost, it quickly took on a life of its own, morphing into a free market of information highly critical of the state. Ultimately, these reforms only accelerated the downfall of the Soviet Empire. And by the end of 1989, the region had begun to change shape dramatically. Hungary had taken down its border fence with Austria, the Solidarity Trade Union and social movement had gained power in Poland, the Baltic states were moving toward independence, and the Berlin Wall had come down. Before the eyes of the world, the Iron Curtain was descending rapidly, and it looked like the Soviet Union's demise was imminent. In the wake of his failure, Gorbachev pointed the finger at glasnost and perestroika, but really, he only had himself to blame. Years before the fall, in the wake of the Chernobyl power plant disaster that occurred in April of 1986, he'd violated his own policy and uncut his authority by suppressing information and downplaying the severity of the accident. Western reports were dismissed. Mayday events were allowed to continue in contaminated areas, and Gorbachev delayed making a public statement until May 14th. His poorly executed official response revealed glasnost's shortcomings and hypocrisy, resulting in an erosion of trust among Soviet citizens. Even more than the failure of perestroika, Gorbachev's failure to properly address Chernobyl, an explosion that released over 400 times the radioactive fallout of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, would eventually be listed among the key factors that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's time as the leader of the Soviet Union lasted just over 6 years, but a lot changed for both the country and the world during that time. Although rooted in the self-interest and poor execution, his policies of perestroika, reconstruction, and glasnost openness gave many citizens their first opportunity to exercise real political freedoms, including freedom of speech. Putin, on the other hand, after assuming power on December 31, 1999, made swift moves to re-establish state control over the political freedoms Gorbachev had attempted to introduce. He started by dismantling Russia's independent media outlets and restricting media access to Chechnya, making balanced coverage of Russia's second war there impossible. Before long, Putin had ramped up his efforts to control many of Russia's oligarchs, a grip that extended to the media empires they controlled. Then there was the 2006 murder of investigative journalist Anna Politkovskaya, which the Russian state was widely suspected to have orchestrated. The final blow to Russia's independent media came in 2022 when legislation was passed down making it illegal to distribute false news about Russia's war in Ukraine. Always the autocrat, perhaps Putin is fearful that an informed/empowered civil society would challenge or even topple his regime. Feeling the pressure of internal discontent as well as the squeeze of external foreign powers, non-governmental factors, and international media, Putin's begun to sound increasingly belligerent and self-pitying, making many leaders in the West start to wonder if they are, or have ever been, dealing with a fully rational actor. The question remains, though, who would replace him? The current distribution of political power in Russia has left no viable alternative. For decades now, Putin has deliberately made himself inseparable from the state. Maybe it's fear that's driving him, but it could also be that the former KGB officer is operating from a place of long-simmering anger about the breakup of the Soviet Union. He also seems to be holding the deeply paranoid assumption that the West has been allied against him, and plotting to hold back the development of Russia ever since. Whatever his deeper motivations might be, it seems that Putin's primary political goals are what might ultimately lead not only to the demise of his regime, but to the fall of the Russian Federation. For one, Putin's drive to reassemble the former Soviet Empire, while casually threatening the use of nuclear weapons on any nation that interferes, has only reminded the West and its allies that NATO remains indispensable to their mutual security. In fact, many see NATO membership as Europe's strongest barrier against Russia's plans for further aggressive expansion. For two, Putin unflinchingly believes that Russians and Ukrainians are a unified people and that true sovereignty for Ukraine is only achievable through collaboration with Russia. Many Ukrainians, on the other hand, hold a very different perspective, and for the first time since gaining their independence, the majority of Ukrainians support jumping on the NATO bandwagon, which means that even if Russia succeeds in occupying Ukraine, Putin could very likely face a determined insurgency to which the US and other allies would eagerly offer their support. And for three, Putin's invasion of Ukraine has only allowed President Biden to demonstrate his commitment to reestablishing America's reputation as the head of collective global security. By holding firm against Putin's relentless demands, Biden has not only earned the confidence of many European allies, but he's also been able to mend some of the reputational damage caused by the Afghanistan fiasco regarding his competence in terms of foreign policy. Putin's highly misguided actions in Ukraine have had the unexpected result of turning this crisis into a moral clash between tyranny and democracy. Throughout his 22-year reign, which has been marked largely by brutality and corruption, Putin has all but extinguished any hope that Russia will move away from its authoritarian history and align itself with the rest of Europe as an open, prosperous, and free society that upholds individual rights and the rule of law. Instead, he's been more than content to manipulate elections, consolidate power, suppress dissent, assassinate regime critics, bolster Russia's military, give aid to friendly oligarchs who are looting the country, and nurse his long-standing grudge against the US and Europe. Sure, Russia has adopted a handful of political terms and institutional ideas from the West, creating nothing more than a flimsy illusion of democracy. In reality, however, these elements are a facade. Few of Russia's current institutions differ in any real way from its long-standing autocratic political culture. But that's not even the scary part. While it might appear that Russian foreign policy has been reckless and unpredictable, and that Moscow's actions are the result of random aggression, Putin has actually been following a distinct set of patterns. And as he nears the end of his fourth term as president, recognizing these patterns will be the key to understanding and possibly anticipating his future political moves. Despite boasting his use of conventional foreign policy tools like diplomacy and global trade, Putin has relied far more heavily on covert measures provided by his intelligence and security services, putting all ethical considerations way down on his list of priorities. Putin has prioritized his interest in absolute power over any set of philosophical rules guiding the moral behavior of government. And this has made it much easier for him and others before him to approach foreign policy as a zero-sum game, where the gain of one state comes at the expense of another, making international political cooperation nearly impossible. But even if it's a losing one, this is the game Putin seems determined to play. So what happens if Putin does lose? What if Russia is forced to retreat from Ukraine and Putin realizes his days on top are numbered? Leaders across the world want to know, if defeat in Ukraine appears imminent, what is Putin going to do? But what many of them are really asking is, would he actually deploy weapons of mass destruction? Would he resort to such drastic measures? He'd have to be insane, right? Well, if we back him into a corner, we might find out. Hopefully, Putin has realized that using either nuclear or chemical weapons would not be in his best interest either. Launching such an attack would turn him into a pariah, leading to complete international isolation for Russia, and likely force the collapse of his regime anyway. The political and economic repercussions would be astronomical, far exceeding the economical and political damage that mounting sanctions have done thus far. With that guy, though, you never know. Putin's core, fundamental perception of Russia seems to be rooted in traditional notions of strength, power, and respect. And because of this, he will do whatever it takes to uphold that image. Hopefully, that doesn't mean using nuclear or chemical weapons on the battlefield. But again, you never know. Part of Putin's campaign to preserve this image of Russia as a nation of superior global strength has been maintaining a sizable and well-equipped military, a task which he's done relatively well for many years. But that doesn't seem to be the case any longer. Talking solely in terms of formations and equipment, Russia's ground forces should have dominated the battlefield in Ukraine on several fronts. But that's not been the case. To truly understand why, though, we need to scrutinize Russia's forces beyond their equipment and the personnel they have using it. Which brings us to the last factor we need to consider when envisioning Russia's potential collapse: its military. To evaluate the competency and capability of its military, the US uses the acronym DOT-MLPF, which stands for Doctrine, Organization, Training, Material, Leadership and Education, Personnel, and Facilities. So hopefully by examining the Russian military through the lens of these categories, we should be able to better understand its ongoing challenges and failures. To start, let's take a look at Russia's strengths, their doctrine, which is essentially the theoretical framework dictating how the army should engage, is clear, precise, well-supported, and conceptually sound. Speaking theoretically, Russian military doctrine often surpasses Western military doctrine. And when executed as intended, as it's outlined in higher military orders, the outcomes of these operations are often successful. On the battlefield, however, Russia's execution of these orders has hardly resembled the proposed theory behind them. There's also the benefit Russia gains with its material, which is generally well-designed and constructed. Take the Orlan-10, for example, the primary drone used by the Russian forces. That's both cost-effective and easy to operate. Although not highly sophisticated, its design makes it challenging to destroy. Typically, it flies too high for short-range air defenses, while being too inexpensive to justifiably destroy with long-range air defenses. But don't be fooled. The Russian military's material also has its share of weaknesses. Primarily, it's inflexible, with a lot of it designed to perform one specific task. There's also the problem of having multiple generations of various systems being deployed simultaneously, making in-field maintenance and repairs a logistical nightmare. And as things have gone from bad to worse in Ukraine, Russia has been forced to pull more and more generations of older equipment out of storage. Russia also lacks an advanced microelectronics industry and therefore must import all of its critical precision weapon components. The bottom line is that Russia's military simply wasn't designed for short, high-intensity wars. Lacking a complete national mobilization strategy, it remains too small and lacks the logistical support for a prolonged foreign campaign. Its equipment is too ill-suited for an extended conflict. On the other side of the scale, one of the Russian military's moderate strengths are its facilities. A prime example is the country's efficient rail network that's been specifically optimized for the movement of combat equipment. Also contributing to their production capabilities are numerous government-controlled munitions factories, as well as access to most of the essential raw materials needed to produce various sorts of bombs and ammunition. But no matter how many bombs or bullets Russia can produce, it won't make up for its near-total lack of quality leadership. Corruption at the highest levels has continued to undermine the military's logistical needs, while fear of exaggerated punishments has created an atmosphere where soldiers will grudgingly carry out orders they know will be utterly ineffective. And from a personnel standpoint, Russia's rapidly aging population has led to a lack of young recruits. There are also few career opportunities for long-term soldiers, making retention a serious problem, leaving the Russian army to depend heavily on non-volunteer conscripts. Many of these draftees also come from areas with very low standards of living and are therefore less familiar with modern technology. Putting age and technological aptitude aside, a military force with no clear ideology, purpose, or examples of quality leadership will undoubtedly be unmotivated, struggle to work effectively as a team, and be unwilling to risk their lives for one another. These are the real issues facing Russia's troops on the ground. Issues that have only gotten worse, severely undermining the Russian infantry's offensive combat power, as the casualties in Ukraine add up. But what is likely the greatest weakness plaguing Russia's military is its training, or lack thereof. Simply put, they don't do enough of it. At the war's outset, for example, there were fewer than 100 fully trained Russian pilots staged at the Ukrainian border, despite there being over 317 combat aircrafts. Russian soldiers also typically receive training that is narrowly focused to their assigned tasks, which results in troops being inflexible, lacking situational awareness, and unable to cover each other's duties effectively. Not to mention that the majority of training occurs at the unit level, meaning that when units are deployed in theater, there's limited time and opportunity to train new recruits before they're sent into combat. Prior to the invasion, an estimated 1/4 of all Russian troops were draftees. And since then, Moscow has only been scrambling to increase its recruitment efforts, which has included extending the age cutoff and recruiting prisoners. Many of Russia's newer recruits seem to be older, unfit, and ill-trained, and so will likely not increase Moscow's overall combat effectiveness. The simple fact is, Russian troops are outnumbered, unmotivated, and relying on equipment that continues to fall apart, which means that Russia's prospects of victory are too rapidly deteriorating. When he started down his path, perhaps Putin believed his troops would be able to perform at least as well as the Soviets did when they intervened on behalf of Afghanistan's communist government back in 1979. It's certainly not impossible to imagine, given the similarities between the conflict and the current state in Ukraine. For one, the US played a similar role then, offering training and supplying light weapons to Mujahideen resistance fighters. But there are a number of important distinctions that must also be made between the Mujahideen and present-day Ukrainian forces. First of all, when Russia invaded in February 2022, Ukraine already had a Western-style national military. And unlike the decentralized and asymmetric nature of the Mujahideen, Ukraine's organized military structure has allowed for a range of highly coordinated efforts. These advanced tactics alone have proven to be highly effective in slowing, if not halting, the Russian offensive. A professional military has also given the Ukraine the option of deploying heavy weapons, an option that would have been impractical, if not impossible, in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, what started with years of intense battles eventually gave way to a decade-long standoff, with the Soviets dominating the cities and the Mujahideen controlling much of the countryside. This will not likely be the case in Ukraine. At first, Ukraine was only getting Cold War-era symptoms from unaligned partners or NATO members' unused stockpiles, raising concerns that Russia's military might swiftly take the advantage. But the supply of modern Western firepower has since picked up, and troops are now using high-tech items like the HIMARS mobile launching system, ATACMS missiles, Harpoon anti-ship missiles, and the counter-battery radars, creating an advantage that's proven disastrous for the Russian opposition. Also inhibiting Russia's fighting ability is the ongoing morale crisis among its troops, as its conscript-heavy units have become increasingly difficult to control. Rampant insubordination has created a lack of trust by senior officers, compelling them to position themselves on the front lines to provide direct oversight. Consequently, this has resulted in a staggering number of casualties among high-ranking officers, which has included an estimated 14 generals and 56 colonels since the start of the war. That's how you know things are getting bad, when leaders at the highest level are getting killed on the battlefield. The surest way to know that things are going from bad to worse, though, is when all a leader can think to do is throw money at the problem. And that's exactly what Putin is doing now. In November 2023, Putin signed a new national budget that will, over the next 3 years, increase national spending by around 25%, with a record amount going to national defense. Total spending in 2024 could reach as much as 36.6 trillion rubles, $415 billion, with an expected deficit of nearly 1.6 trillion rubles, $9.5 billion. After Putin had signed, a representative from the Russian parliament said, without giving specifics, that the budget was geared toward funding the military and mitigating the impact of international sanctions. But even if certain sanctions of the budget are kept secret, mostly to conceal Russia's military plans for Ukraine, it's been estimated that around 39% of all federal spending will go toward defense and law enforcement in 2024. If Putin wants to put all his eggs in one basket, that's fine. But he should probably keep in mind that as the Soviet Union neared its tipping point, military spending remained consistent. Detachment from all economic trends, even as the Soviet economy floundered, its military remained well-funded. And even as the conflict in Afghanistan dragged on year after year, when it came to research and development, the military continued to take priority. Putin, it appears, has fully committed himself to repeating the same mistakes. The funny thing is, more money will likely only exacerbate one of the Russian military's most serious problems. From incomprehensible logistical decisions to plain old theft, widespread corruption runs rampant on almost every level. Starting at the lowest level, recruiters have started to overstate the number of enlistees. Then, when funds come in to outfit the new troops, they simply pocket the difference. Sources at the Pentagon have said that dysfunctional practices like these will ultimately prevent Russia from reaching its pre-invasion recruitment goals, let alone expand its military to more than 1 million troops, as Putin intends. Reports coming from Chechnya and Georgia have, too, included descriptions of serious problems with many of Russia's fighting vehicles and other equipment. These ongoing malfunctions have been attributed to everything from purposeful misreporting to the siphoning of ministry dollars, from flat-out negligence to outright theft. These, along with the whole slew of other corrupt practices, have literally pulled the armor from Russia tanks, while polluting the true numbers of its forces and greatly undermining its ability to properly equip its frontline troops. In one particularly embarrassing episode, many of the armored columns that first advanced on Kyiv were ultimately stopped far outside the city, not because of local resistance, but because they'd run out of fuel. Reports about the incident appeared almost immediately, citing various causes for the snafu. Poor logistics slowed many vehicles, while others were simply blown up en route. It was also proposed, however, that the Russian army never actually possessed the amount of fuel needed to make the push, because large quantities of it had been sold on the black market in Belarus. Due in large part to shoddy maintenance practices, an estimated 1/3 of Russia's vehicles have failed on their own. While reports that troops have been eating expired rations, likely because their supply officers either sold the new ones or never bought them in the first place, have also emerged. Further logistical issues have led to shortages of infantry troops, leaving Russia's tanks vulnerable to attack by ground-based Ukrainian anti-tank teams. Many of Russia's tanks have also rolled into battle without a full crew, seriously undermining their ability to perform. Content to ignore such obvious instances of corruption within his ranks, Putin continues to give a slew of his loyal oligarchs permission to siphon public funds. Now, with everyone playing dirty and Putin looking the other way, the Russian military has yet again reverted to highly corrupt practices. Skimming, stealing, and misallocation of money, equipment, supplies, and other resources have become the norm, as everyone seeks to take their cut. With this sort of thing going on, how can Russia's leaders possibly expect to achieve victory in Ukraine? In the age of modern warfare, there are several factors that will surely lead to defeat: a lack of cohesion and structure, poor leadership and corruption, and a lack of determination by troops on the ground to defend the state and its interests. Well, Russia's military has hit the trifecta, and if it doesn't shape up soon, being run out of Ukraine will be the least of its concerns. If Russia's military were to collapse, this would come with a range of serious consequences. First of all, the West might get inspired to provide more training and equipment to Russia's neighboring countries. Secondly, faced with the potential weaker Russian army, the West might also change its thinking on just how vulnerable the Baltics and Eastern Europe might be to Russian aggression. And lastly, because of the success certain weapon systems have had in Ukraine, such as portable anti-armor and anti-air systems, some Western militaries might begin to bulk up their current dwindling stockpiles. If Russia is defeated in Ukraine, this might also boost the West's confidence enough to challenge Putin's aggressive acts elsewhere, despite any veiled nuclear threats. Or this wouldn't be the first time the US at least has confronted a nuclear-armed state, namely the USSR during the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1962 and the Yom Kippur War in 1973. But even in the unlikely event that Russia does make a direct nuclear threat, the US might still wait to respond until current military actions and international sanctions have run their course. Overall, things are not looking good for Russia at the moment. In the coming months, or perhaps years, its military could be neutralized. Its political system might erode itself from the inside. Its economy might stagnate, and its citizens may revolt. Unfortunately, even if Russia soon crumbles under the weight of its own misgivings, the Ukrainian people will undoubtedly experience ongoing hardships. And as they are now, residents in Northern and Central Europe will face energy shortages and inflation, while the US will experience a slight uptick in inflation as well. Certain areas of the developing world, however, particularly in Northern Africa and the Middle East, will likely experience the most extreme hardships. Countries like Egypt, that rely heavily on Ukraine for wheat, a crucial dietary staple, especially for poorer segments of the population, have already begun struggling to find substitutes. Poorer nations in Eastern Europe that are reliant on Russia and Ukraine for both energy and the sale of their goods will also continue to face mounting economic challenges. Really, the impact of Russia's collapse will follow much of the same pattern as the current crisis in the region, meaning it will vary significantly depending on geographical location. And if things weren't already complicated enough, the fall of Putin's regime would only further strain the relationship between the US and China. For now, China has Russia as a national security ally, as they move toward weakening the US economically and advancing their own position as an emerging superpower. At the same time, though, China can't overtly support Russia without violating sanctions imposed by the US and its allies. A misstep here could really hurt China's economy, and Beijing definitely doesn't want that. But as long as China doesn't publicly condemn Russia and hold up the same sanctions, the West isn't going to see them as a true team player, leaving the two nations to grow more suspicious and less cooperative. And if this happens, we might end up at a crucial juncture where multinational corporations and governments are forced to definitively pick a side, where a more strategic approach might involve doubling down on one's economic relationship with either China or the US. The problem with this one or the other approach is that it could easily take on a life of its own, leading to highly complex business relationships, differing technological standards, and diminished economic options. But how likely is it that we'll actually get to this point? Even the world's leading experts seem to be divided on this issue. In a recent study conducted by the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, surveyors asked 167 of the leading global strategists and foresight practitioners about some of the biggest changes coming over the next 10 years. Nearly half of these experts, around 46%, said that Russia would either become a failed state or break apart by 2033. While 40% of the experts surveyed believed that if Russia were to break up internally by 2033, it would be because of revolution, civil war, political disintegration, or some currently unknown factor. On the bright side, the majority of survey respondents, 58%, seemed optimistic that no nation will use nuclear weapons at any point in the next decade. However, nearly one-third of respondents, 31%, believed we would see a nuclear conflict by 2033. The fact it would more likely be a regional conflict as opposed to a global one is only slightly comforting. And the most likely candidate the experts pointed to at kicking things off? Yep, Russia. After that, they thought North Korea would be the nation most likely to deploy nuclear weapons against one of its non-nuclear neighbors, as opposed to, say, a country with superior nuclear capabilities like the United States. Putin's regime may have been weakened by a number of crucial miscalculations about Russia's military strength, Ukraine's resolve, and the West's backbone. But the prospect of a total collapse for Russia still seems a bit absurd. There's no definitive evidence yet that Putin will be dislodged from his seat of power or that the Russian Federation will subsequently implode. Many of those who are in doubt of an impending collapse have even cited that the lack of Russian protests against the war, Putin's leadership, or the ongoing mobilization of conscripts as evidence of Russia's perceived stability. We can't forget, though, that these activities are a serious crime in Russia. The personal biases of some Western commentators may, too, have contributed to an exaggerated assessment of Russia's vulnerability. After all, the US didn't disintegrate after its embarrassing withdrawal from Vietnam, or Iraq, or Afghanistan. With that said, however, even if there's little evidence to support a full-on collapse, we still can't overlook the unpredictability of this sort of authoritarian regime. Which means if the walls do come down, we will likely be looking at an erosion or implosion scenario, as opposed to Russia being crushed from the outside. What we can be even more sure of, though, is that before, during, and after the hypothetical fall of Russia, we will be seeing a massive surge of ethnic and civil unrest. That is, more than the amount we're seeing already. That stems partly from the relative poverty experienced by many of Russia's minorities, combined with these groups being largely overrepresented in the Russian military. Russia's casualties in Ukraine have, too, come disproportionately from the poorest ethnic groups: Dagestanis, Chechens, Ingush, Buryats, and Tuvans. While the Kremlin's recent campaign to draft an additional 300,000 troops for service also targets these same groups. We can also be sure that the harder life becomes for people in Moscow or St. Petersburg, the more likely we are to see a full-on human rights crisis among Russia's ethnic minorities, culminating in the threat of a fragmented or internally conflicted Russia, resulting in a localized breakdown along ethnic lines that could potentially give rise to various aspiring nuclear-armed statelets. Moving forward, if Russia does manage to keep its lights on, it will likely have little to do with the will of the country's elites or with Western policies. More powerful forces are at work here, as Putin's Russia, which could be far more fragile than his posturing would suggest, struggles for stability amid a slew of mutually reinforcing tensions. Would the collapse of Russia be violent, you ask? Well, the answer here is probably yes. State collapses are usually violent, and even though the collapse of the Soviet Union was relatively peaceful, there's an argument that the war in Ukraine is, in a sense, a delayed wave of violence initiated by that historical event. A collapse would likely generate several civil wars between new statelets that would fight over borders and economic assets, while Moscow's elites would react to any secessionism with their own violent resistance. Realistically, along with the violent destabilization of the region, we could expect to see an avalanche of migration to countries like France, Germany, and the Netherlands. Brussels would also likely open its borders, and the EU as a whole would find itself responsible to assist. We could also expect a long road back to stability in the region. Some experts have estimated that it could take more than 30 years to reverse the damage that's already been done to Russia's economy and military, not to mention its reputation. But what do you think? Is Russia headed for collapse? What specific factors or events might lead it in that direction? And what might the fate of Putin's regime be moving forward? Let us know in the comments. Now watch Why Invading Russia is a Bad Idea, or Simulating Nuclear War Between Russia and NATO.